Ever since the Switch 2 reveal trailer dropped, I've been seeing various iterations of this meme or this take circulating around online, stating that the Switch 2 is Nintendo's first ever console that didn't radically redesign its controller or its form factor or what have you. Am I losing my mind? Like, what are you talking about? Well, I can certainly understand that some people are disappointed that the Switch 2 is in fact an iteration of the Switch, despite that being something a lot of us have been asking for. Can we just stop getting revisionist here in order to prove some point? Because this idea is completely untrue. I mean, even just looking at this meme, the Wii U gamepad is right there, and you're going to put the Switch next to it and call it a radical redesign? Are you blind? In fact, Nintendo has been far more consistent than we seem to be giving them credit for. I would argue that the only radical departures in their designs have been the Virtual Boy and the Wii. Even then, the Virtual Boy controller doesn't look that different from a standard gaming controller. I don't really know what's going on with the D-pad on the right side, but whatever. So really it's just the VR part of it that was different. Of course, I don't need to explain to you how the Wii was a big shakeup in terms of how it designed its controller, swapping out the traditional button scheme for, well, a remote. But let's take a moment to look at Nintendo's entire console lineup and see it from the other angle, the angle of consistency. First of all, the SNES controller is clearly a refinement of the NES controller. And yes, these are the Switch versions of these controllers, but they're wireless, so it was easier for me to show you. Generally speaking, it kept the same form factor, but added more buttons and made it more ergonomic. This also establishes the 4 face button layout that most consoles, not just Nintendo's, would use going forward. Yeah, it could be argued that these are off-brand Super Nintendo controllers. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love my other consoles, but they clearly have their roots in this. The N64 controller is one that people are going to point to as being an oddball, and at a glance, yes, I can see why. But I'd argue it's not as different as people think. In fact, if we just ignore the 3 prongs for a moment, you'll see that this is basically an iteration of the SNES controller. D-pad on the left, face buttons on the right, L and R on the top. The major additions here are the control stick, which was a brand new thing for a home console, the Z button on the back, and the grips to make it more comfortable to hold. The idea behind the controller was that for traditional 2D games, you would use it like an SNES controller, holding it this way, and for 3D games, you would swap your left hand to the center grip, holding it this way. It just so happens that almost no games used the SNES control scheme, making this potentially the most underutilized D-pad in gaming history. That said, it's still an iteration on what came before. It just was able to do more things since it had more buttons, just like the SNES controller had more buttons than the NES controller did. Still with me? The GameCube controller is legendary, and I need to clean this one. But again, it is clearly iterative. I think that they prioritized it being an ergonomic controller above all else, and it took the hard lessons they learned from the N64. The 4 buttons with shoulders that had been established already by the SNES, D-pad, now twin sticks, all the usual trappings that were becoming standard, and simply arranged them in a more comfortable way. But A, B, X, and Y, with L and R as shoulder buttons, it's all here. It could do everything that the controllers that came before it could, aside from having a select button. It's weird that that one skipped 2 generations. Now, as I said before, the Wii is admittedly the oddball here, the one that counts as a radical redesign, but that was the point. After all, its codename was Revolution. So instead of dwelling on it, we'll move on. But it did have a classic controller, which is, yeah, it's still the SNES controller. Sorry, I didn't record this properly the first time through, but just as a bonus tidbit, the nunchuck for the Wii Remote it is basically just the center prong of the N64 controller. They both even have the Z button tucked underneath there. So that's basically, they just took this from this. Now, before looking at the Wii U, I'd like to deviate into Nintendo's handheld space for a moment, because the Switch is a handheld hybrid console, right? So we should cover that ground before we get there. And the handheld space has been remarkably consistent. The Game Boy used the NES control scheme. Please forgive the condition of this old thing. Game Boy Color kept it. The Game Boy Advance took the LNR from the SNES controller. These are all iterations, not radical redesigns. Of course, the DS took the clamshell design from the Game Boy Advance SP and added a second screen, with one being a touchscreen. But take a look at the button layout. It's the SNES controller still. The 3DS is a clear iteration of that, adding the circle pad, which is basically a thumbstick that got squished down. So we can see a clear design evolution, but it is very consistent. They just keep adding little things. With that out of the way, let's return to the home console space and look at the Wii U. The Wii U returns home consoles to the SNES control scheme. It adds a second screen, one of which is a touchscreen, and okay, the Wii U is basically 3 GameCubes duct taped together with the 3DS cut in half as its controller. In fact, some games actually did let you use a 3DS as a controller for the Wii U. How cool was that? As a bonus, the Wii U Pro controller is likewise a very beefed up SNES controller. Or you could say it's just the Wii U gamepad without the screen. But this is a very traditional game controller. Finally, the Switch. It's the Wii U gamepad, much more refined, much nicer and sleeker looking. Mind you, my Wii U sticks never had any drift issues, but yeah, that's what this is. Sure, you can take the controllers off, it can do more things than this could, but there's a clear design evolution here, right? Of course, there's also no dual screenplay like the Wii U had, but you know, that barely got used. It was mostly just for menus and stuff, so it's not really a feature that I miss. This still uses the SNES button layout. The Switch Pro controller likewise stays in line and is just frankly a great controller. But you can put these side by side and you can tell that this is the grandfather of this, right? My point here is not to say that Nintendo isn't innovative. They absolutely are, but I also think it's dishonest to look at these two things side by side and call this a radical redesign over this. If you took any pair of these controllers in isolation, maybe a case could be made, as long as one of those controllers wasn't the SNES controller, because that thing in some shape or form is basically immortal. But when talking about the evolution of their entire console lineup over the years, you have to look at the gradual change from generation to generation. Otherwise, you're cherry picking. There are genuine criticisms to make here, but this argument feels like contrarians trying to be party poopers when people are just excited about a new Nintendo console. Don't rain on their parades, my dude. It's like just trying to sow the seeds of disappointment for no reason. I'm aware Nintendo consoles have had big new gimmicks often, but the Switch form factor is one that I really love, and I'm happy to see it stay. I didn't want to see that form factor go. I like it. It works well for me, for my lifestyle, for my household. I think it's great. Innovation is great, but I also think there is merit to looking back at your own history and learning from your own past. Does that make sense? Thanks for making it to the end of this rant video. Special thanks goes to my patrons and channel members, the names of which are on screen right now. I swear I'm working on some of my usual Zelda content. Stay tuned. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.